remember the responsibility you have as a person or as an educator. I came from a very small town with a band director who, for whatever reason, noticed me and said, Jimmy, because I was really short, Jimmy, let's do this. You're pretty good. Why don't we try this? And he took, when you take notice of somebody and you realize what special gifts he or she might have, it means a lot to a little kid to have somebody notice that. And I think that all those little experiences I had as a young kid, they have shaped who I am. So I think everybody who's listening might just realize that the responsibility they have and the opportunity they have to really shape somebody else's life and make a difference.
Hello everyone, welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor, I'm a composer, and this is episode 46. My guest for this episode is Jim Stephenson. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening and for your support. I'd like to ask if you can help me in a couple of ways. I rely on word of mouth to spread the show to new listeners. If you think you know of one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Also, a word about this episode. I apologize for any problems with audio quality. This is only my second live interview that I've done, and I recorded Jim at the Florida Music Educators Conference in Tampa, and we recorded it out by the bay, and there was a lot of background noise, but I do have a colleague at Webster University who's an audio production engineer named Casey Hunter, and I'd like to give a big thank you to Casey for helping me to get this to a listenable state, and I hope that it's okay for you. Now, on to the episode. Jim, thanks for joining me.
Great to be here, Mark. Nice to do it in this beautiful setting here in Florida.
So for my listeners, Jim and I are talking on the veranda overlooking Tampa Bay at the Florida Music Educators Association conference. Jim and I are both from the Midwest, and so this is a much nicer place to do this.
Feels good, that's for sure.
So Jim, can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I could take up your whole program with my story, but essentially the short story is that I grew up playing trumpet and wanted to be a professional trumpeter my entire career. Was very fortunate to land a job at the age of 21 playing with an orchestra actually just down the road in Naples, Florida. So I was second trumpet in the Naples Philharmonic for what turned out to be 17 years, but kind of in the beginning stages of that, I started arranging first for brass quintet, then for our own orchestra. I did a lot of those, probably 120 arrangements for orchestra. And then it's like, well, if I'm arranging other people's notes, why don't I compose my own? So I started composing just for fun, purely by chance, almost by accident. And then that, over the next 10 years, turned into my career enough that in 2007, my wife and I quit our positions with the Naples Philharmonic and moved to Chicago, where I'm now a full-time composer.
So there's a couple questions there, of course. So your wife is a musician as well?
She's a violinist, yeah.
Okay, so that's a big decision to quit a professional orchestral gig, what most musicians are striving for, to decide to become a composer, do it on your own. And so what went into that a little bit more, if you don't mind?
Well, there were several factors. First of all, something had to give. And that was like her quote to me on that February day of 2000 or November day of 2006 when she looked at me and said, something's got to give, because I was composing late at night to try to meet deadlines. We had 4 young kids at that point, so we'd be getting up early or in the middle of the night changing diapers, then going to rehearsals, then handing our kids off to babysitters to go play concerts, and we were just both completely wiped out. And so she looked at me and said, well, why don't we try composing? We can take a sabbatical, we can move to Chicago, live with family, and just try it out for a while and see what happens. And so the short answer to that part is, once we moved to Chicago, we knew we were home. I mean, there was no going back. And that's where we've been the last 10 years. So yeah, there's a lot there. You know, that decision, I've heard other composers say that when they've decided to go to composition, they come from other things. We were talking about Johann de Meij's interview, how he was arranging for his police band, if I recall, and it's the same thing. How did you start arranging? What was that? Who sort of caught that and said, hey, Jim, arrange these? Yeah, no, that's a great question. as part of your job when you join an orchestra, I remember I was 21, so I hadn't had any experience doing what we were getting asked to do, which was to go out to all the elementary schools in the area and demonstrate our instruments and do the whole spiel about why classical music is wonderful and why everybody should play trumpet and all that sort of thing. So you're going out with your brass quintet to 25 schools a year, and you're playing your show, and you're just doing, basically after a while, you're just doing the same thing over and over again. I mean, you're trying to make it interesting for the kids, of course, but you can only play Las's trombone so many times.
Right.
And so finally somebody said, well, these kids love Disney movies. Why don't we play a Disney tune for them? And I think it was our horn player who said, so who wants to arrange one? Uh-huh. And for some reason, I raised my hand and I said, I'll do it.
Did you have experience at the university or in high school doing that? Any arranging?
The only thing I can remember doing, and maybe there's other instances, but the only thing I remember two things. Writing a chorale when I was a student at Interlochen in summer camp. And like nobody responded to it, so I was like, okay, I guess I won't be a composer. And then I thought it was kind of cool, actually. And then I wrote a fugue, I think, as an assignment in college, I think. I honestly don't remember, but no, I didn't do a ton of arranging or composing.
So that means you left school before you finished then if you were in the Naples Orchestra at 21.
I won the job 2 weeks before I graduated.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Very lucky.
And so let's back up a little bit and can you tell the listeners about your sort of early history and your like where you grew up and how you got started on the trumpet?
Yeah. I saw a trumpet laying on the couch because my brother had left it sitting there, my older brother. And I picked it up and tried to make a sound, and for whatever reason, I was able to make actually, I still remember, I made a pretty good sound, and he said, well, Jim, here's Jimmy. He said, Jimmy, here's how we make a scale, and so he showed me a scale, and quickly thereafter, I was taking trumpet lessons, and, this is all luck. I don't really know how it happened, but I was sitting first chair in the band, and was good enough that my parents said, well, we should send you to Interlochen for summer camp, and I went there 7 summers. And then Interlochen said, well, we'd love to have you at our high school. So I ended up going to the academy, and within 2 weeks of sitting down at the academy, I was playing Dvorak 8 and Tchaik 4 and Firebird. I'm 14 years old and playing the Hummel trumpet concerto. And so it was just like, oh, this is fun. I'll keep doing this. So that's why I said early on, I thought trumpet was going to be my life forever. I wanted to be, I've said this many times and people laugh at me as they should, I wanted to be first chair of the Chicago Symphony. I mean, that's where I grew up. That's what I wanted to do.
Sure. And you're from Chicago originally?
I am, yeah.
Yeah. And you live in Chicago now?
Yes, we've moved back.
Yeah, I mean, I was a trumpet player as a young musician as well, and of course that was the Adolf Herzog,
right.
That whole thing.
Oh,
we all want to be Bud Herzog, and I
still remember listening. I found 5 recordings. I was 12, and I found 5 recordings of him playing Pictures. The opening solo. Right. Because I was curious how to get one was faster, one he had a brighter sound, one was slower, more majestic. Of course, these probably all came from the conductor, but so I started playing Pictures, trying to figure out how to make all these different sounds that he was doing. It was cool.
How old were you when that happened? Do you remember?
12.
You were 12, yeah.
Found these five recordings, and
that's awesome. That's awesome.
It was on B-flat trumpet, but
sure,
did my best.
Well, I don't think you know any better when you're 12, right? You just make it work.
No, and that's the beauty of all this, right? You just figure it out.
Yeah. Do you remember any early teachers that really influenced you when you were
as a trumpet player?
Yeah.
Absolutely. First of all, when I went to Interlochen and one guy leaned over my shoulder and he said, hey, you have pretty good rhythm. It's like, what's rhythm? Oh, okay. So I was like, I remember that moment. One of my early teachers named Peter Labella in the Chicago area, and I now know his daughter. She's a harpist in the area, so it's kind of cool to stay in touch. He was so generous with his time. I remember I would go down to his basement. I'd be scared to death because he was kind of a hardcore teacher, and I never practiced. But he just really took to me and ended up giving me a lot of his copies of his music, and he would give me early David Hickman recordings and say, listen to this. And so I still have etude books that have his name signed on them. And then John Lindenau at the Interlochen Arts Academy, I remember it was when I was playing the Hummel trumpet concerto. He came up to me after rehearsal and said, Jim, it'd be okay to make some music. It's okay to play the notes, but go ahead and shape a phrase or something. And, I was 14, and he managed to say that at the exact right time. I was like, oh, you mean I can put my own personality into this? So.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing, especially for young musicians. We all know the hardest thing to teach a kid to do, or a young musician to do, is to play the phrase. Yeah. And in some cases, it's the hardest thing to teach an adult musician to do as well.
That's true.
And so, do you remember how he worded that, or?
It was exactly that. So he didn't say, and I think this is crucial, he didn't say, let's take this louder here, or don't breathe here, or whatever. He just said, it's okay to make some music.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And then he let you and
he let me take over.
Your instincts.
And it instantly affected how I did everything from that point forward.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
It's funny how people respond to different things, and how good teachers know exactly what to say to each person.
Yeah.
Did you have much band experience?
Not as much as I would have liked at this point doing what I'm doing.
Right.
I played in my grade school band. I should mention him too. He, my first band director, David Ragnar. Oh, I hope it's David. No, Larry Ragnar. Anyway, forgive me, Mr. Ragnar. He recognized that I was able to kind of get around on the horn okay.
Sure.
And so, we were playing pretty easy music,
right,
given that we were a middle school band. But he would give me the clarinet part and say, Jim, why don't you try your luck on it? And so I'd be marching down the street playing the clarinet part to some arrangement of Dvorak's New World Symphony or something. I still remember trying to play that.
Sure.
I'm like, man, this is hard. So I played in my middle school band, and then, of course, going to Interlochen every summer, I would play in the whatever level I was at, the intermediate band, the high school band. But at Interlochen, they sort of segregated you after a while. You had to make a choice. Are you going to play in the band or in the orchestra? And so because I was geared towards an orchestral career at that point, I didn't get to play a lot of the band music that many people walking around this building know like the back of their hand. So I kind of missed out on that experience. You're
writing mostly concert band music now. I know you write a lot of things, but you write a lot of concert band music.
I do. I mean, I would say it depends how you split it. I mean, I'm writing 4 major orchestral works next year. And one's a symphony, and one's a concerto, and one's a 25-minute chamber music piece. So that's 4 of those next year versus like 9 band pieces. So, which one, the orchestra is probably the same amount of minutes for both of those.
Fewer pieces, just
So I'm enjoying keeping an even split there as much as I can.
It's a rare composer that can write for the orchestra world and get performances too. So kudos to you for that.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. It's for as long as possible, right?
Well, I enjoy doing both, so it's okay. Whatever happens.
Yeah. Have you found that your connections as an orchestral trumpet player helped you?
Oh, absolutely. Completely. I mean, my whole career has been defined by who I've known in my former life as a performer. So, I mean, it was those people early on who found out that I was composing, said, hey, Jim, do you want to write me a trumpet sonata? How about a trombone sonata? Do you want to do an oboe concerto? All that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And, and then when you write the music, hopefully that in turn leads to other collaborations. But
yeah, we're definitely in a personality business. It's about creating relationships and getting to know people. And that's how you build opportunity for yourself, whether you're starting out as a band director or you're 40 years into your career. It's all about the people you know and the relationships you build, for sure.
Probably true for almost every business. I mean,
I think so.
I hope we stay a community relationship or personal relationship world. I'd hate to see us get too apart from one another.
Yeah, you can't really make music too transactional. And that transactional is not the right word, but impersonal.
Right.
Because ultimately it's about emotion, hopefully.
Yeah, and working together for a unified goal, So.
Now, Jim, you and I have had some conversation about this, but you're self-published.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's that been looking like, and how do you manage the business of being self-published?
Yeah, well, the reason I'm self-published is just because of my first experience. I had literally written one of my first pieces was a tuba concerto, and it got published by a relatively well-known brass publication. And I got my royalty statement after my first year of sales, and I was like, well, I didn't know how any of it worked. And I remember looking at that, and my jaw dropped to the floor. It was like $50 for 50 sold copies or something of a tuba concerto, and so I said maybe there's Finale was just starting at that point, so I was like, oh, maybe there's a different way to do this. So every bit of self-publishing for me has just been kind of learning how to do it on the fly, At this point, my wife is a huge part of the Stephenson music team, if you will. We have the big copy machine in our basement, which we lease. It's like having a nice car in our basement because it's so darn expensive. But so I mean, I'm hugely fortunate that I can just write the music, and when an order comes in, it goes to my wife, and she prints it, sells it. She prints it, ships it, and helps me stay on top of that part of it, because there's no way I could do both. And, I take pride in how it looks and the covers and all that sort of thing, and try to make it the best product I can from first impression through final note, So it's kind of my goal.
So your wife definitely helps you with that business aspect of it.
Big time, yeah.
Yeah. And so you're just publishing your own music at this point.
At this point, yeah. I've considered looking into expanding. I don't know where that's going to go, but
yeah. Interestingly enough, one of my more recent episodes is Walter Cummings, who founded Grand Mesa Music, and the same thing he did in his basement with his wife.
Is that right?
He was a middle school band director, and he wanted to write his own music for his bands, and was struggling to find his own publisher, and he self-published, and now he publishes other people. He started out only himself, and then he switched, and now his business has been other people. But it's really interesting how composers arrive at that decision that this model isn't working for me.
Well, and I've had to go through the steps of figuring it all out and having a big copy machine and color and printing and binding and all that stuff. So if I can be a vehicle to help somebody else out, I mean, that's something I'm toying with. I haven't figured it out yet, but
yeah, and I think I talk to people from both sides of this fence, the commercial publishing and the self-publishing, and I think there are valid reasons for every individual to make the choices that they make about what they want to do with their music, and sort of where their careers are and what they're doing with the rest of their lives beyond just, because self-publishing requires a huge time investment. Yeah.
If I didn't have my wife, there's no way I could maintain the schedule. And
you and I briefly talked about one of the big questions about self-publishing: what happens to our music when we pass away? And it's funny, you're the second person within half an hour I had that conversation with. Yeah. So you want to talk about that? What do we do with that as composers?
Well, I mean, I hadn't thought enough about it until we just talked about it briefly, but I mean, it has come up in my mind, and that's the reason I had 4 kids, so that hopefully one of them will take care of my music. One's getting a business degree, so hopefully, Deanna, if you're listening to this, I need some help in my business. No, I mean, it is something we have to think about, because if we want this quote-unquote legacy to live beyond us, we need to think about where it's going to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if it's going to be a big publisher, big meaning commercial publisher, who takes over our music, which one do we choose? Like you said, it's a tough thing. And actually, I was on the board of the American Composers Forum for a while, and this question came up there too. And I wasn't on the board long enough to kind of continue. I don't know where they've gone with that discussion, but it is something that I think a lot of us, if we're not already considering, maybe we should start thinking about it.
All right, Jim. So what does it look like to commission a work from you? If I'm a band director and I want to get a piece of music by Jim Stephenson.
Gosh, these come in all shapes and sizes, of course. Sometimes it's for a specific anniversary, or it's to be about a person or something. So there's that discussion. What is this about? There's the basics, of course. How long do you want it to be? This is what I charge. When is it due? Is always probably the first question that needs to be answered. Whether it'll fit into the current schedule. For me, we were talking about interpersonal relationships. The conversation with the person is extremely important to me. The person, if it's a concerto, the person I'm writing it for, if it's a band director, what it's about. There's usually something that happens in a phone conversation. Usually I like to talk by phone because emails don't really convey this. There's something they'll say that will immediately conjure up a musical motif in my head, or even maybe the form of the entire piece. So a lot can happen in that phone call, which kind of makes my producing of the piece a lot easier, actually. And then it helps me write a piece that I wouldn't have already written. I never want to be a quote-unquote formulaic composer, so I want each piece to be about what the person hiring me needs it to be about. I mean, they're the ones spending the money. They're the ones that have this idea and respect my music enough to hire me. So for me, I need to respect that and make the piece what they're hoping for as much as I possibly can.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you talk about the performer. You've written a lot of concerti.
I have, yeah.
And you've written concerti for some really fine brass players.
I've been really, really lucky. I will never take any of that for granted, yeah.
Yeah. So how much does that play into, how much is the personality of the performer? So I know you have pieces for Ryan Anthony and Rex Richardson, and how does that influence the writing?
100%. I can tell a story to answer that. I mean,
sure.
I once wrote a concerto for. It was a situation where I didn't know the soloist at all. Didn't know their playing. Didn't know their personalities. Didn't know their sound. I mean, their sound is so important. It's so key to what a piece is going to sound like. And I have to admit that that's a piece that I don't bring up very often. I was not thrilled with the result. Now, maybe a lot of that's my fault. Maybe I should have just turned something off in my brain and figure out a different way to compose that piece. But for whatever reason, I've written a lot for people I know, and if I didn't know them, I would try to get to know them, just so, because that informs my music entirely, completely.
Of course.
I think that's the way it's been in history, I would imagine.
I think so. When we look at like Brahms and Joaquin, and
they'd get together and hash it out.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you're a composer, that's how you learn. I mean, you've written a lot of brass music, and you're a brass player. That helps, but
it does. But I've also written 2 violin concertos, and each woodwind instrument has a concerto, and so I had to. I don't know those instruments, so I had to also be willing for them to say to me, Jim, not so much. This doesn't work so well, and that's great. That's what I want to know.
Yeah, sure. So I want to come back a little bit. You talked about the trumpet, and when you were a kid, you played clarinet parts. And I want to bring us back to the band world a little bit. And one of the things, and I spoke with Pete Meekin about this as well, and Pete and I talked about the British brass band tradition, and how in the British brass band tradition, the cornet parts tend to carry much of the motion in the ensemble.
Right.
What is our responsibility as composers to the trumpet, specifically at that instrument, for it to help kids become more technically proficient as opposed to just that idiomatic trumpet part that seems so common in band music?
Wow. I'm going to give you the worst answer for this.
Well, I ambushed you here a little bit.
You did. That wasn't on the list. No, I have to tell you, I just write what I hear. And if I hear a trumpet having to play a certain line, I mean, yes, I'm a trumpet player, so I guess some of that is already imbued. I know what they can do and can't do. But if I really hear that trumpet going up to a certain note that might be a little awkward on a B flat trumpet, but it has to be there, if I shy away from that, I'm kind of doing a disservice to the music and to the industry and to the instrument and to the performers, and because if it's written within reason, if I work my way up there or something, they're going to figure it out, and at least that way we're not taking a step backward. I don't know. The short answer is it's all about the music.
Yeah.
And so that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of the technical abilities of all of our performers, doesn't that sort of come from composers maybe not knowing everything about the instruments? I mean, composers just writing for, like, if they write something crazy hard for a clarinet or for a violin, the performers figure it out, and then that becomes part of the repertoire, and young kids figure it out, and they get better and better.
I think 2 thoughts. First, I do the interview here, Jim.
Sorry.
No, I think maybe to a certain extent you're right, and I think a lot of times composers hear an idea that they want to have, and then it's our job as musicians, if I put my performer hat on, it's my job to play that regardless of whether it's something that's established or not. Otherwise, how do we move forward?
I've had as we said, I've written a lot of concertos. I've had every single I've had a wide variety of responses where people will say, "You've written it, I'm going to figure out how to play it." So I've had that response,
That's a pretty common one.
And then I've had others where they have come back to me and said, can you change this? Can you change this? So I've had the entire spectrum.
Right.
One, I'll tell you about a piece I wrote for Joe Alessi. I wrote him a trombone concerto with trombone ensemble and sent away the music and never heard from him again. At least about that piece. I mean, I've talked to him. I've seen him several times. But I never heard from him about that piece. I sent emails like, hey, Joe, is it okay? Fast forward a year later, I got the recording, finished recording with him with a trombone ensemble over in Europe, and it was exactly the way I wanted it to be. So there was never any back and forth about, hey, Jim, is this okay? Tempos, can you change this? Never any back and forth, and it ended up, he's Joe Alessi.
Of course. That must have really sort of been a little nerve-wracking. I would have panicked a little bit, I'm sure.
Well, when I got the CD, I was like, here we go, because it's done. There's nothing I could do. So, and I was thrilled, absolutely thrilled. Yeah.
Do you have any general advice you'd give to young composers? Maybe someone who's either in a teaching job and thinking about composing, in college thinking about composing, or perhaps even what was in your situation, someone who's arranging a lot of music and thinks they might want to start writing original music?
Well, I'm sort of jealous of young composers because they're in a situation I was never in, which is studying composition in college, which I didn't do. Maybe I shouldn't admit that publicly, but now I just did. So they're in an environment where they have so many resources at their disposal, whether it's performers they can ask questions to, whether it's the library, recordings, everything they can just walk down the hallway and learn from right at their disposal. So I didn't have that. So I would say to a young composer, take advantage of that. One thing I try to stress, though I'm not really sure it's working, well, I don't know, but there are no shortcuts. You're going to have to work hard regardless of whether you have an instant success or whether you don't have your first big success for 20 years. Either way, you're going to have to work hard always. There are no shortcuts. Because if you have a success at age 21, you're going to have to live up to that afterward and afterward and afterward. So you're going to have to keep working. So be prepared for that. And also, write your music and put your phone away. There's no substitute for 4 hours of getting into that zone of composing. You can't have emails constantly popping up, and this has been said a million times, so I don't need to say it. But my best composing comes when I put my phone in a different room, and I'm as guilty as anyone else when it comes to social media and all that.
So, what was your first big success that made you say, "Hey, I think I want to do this"?
I'm still waiting for it. No,
well, we'll talk about that in a minute.
It was kind of interesting. It was a personal success that nobody seemed to notice, to be honest with you. I wrote one of my first orchestral pieces was The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and we premiered it. I'm going to get my year wrong, but I think it was 1996, give or take 2 or 3 years, with my own orchestra in Naples. And I was really proud of what I had done. I had researched Washington Irving's book, his story, and I found all these what I thought were kind of cool references to that time period, which I snuck into the music. So I did a lot of research, and I thought I actually still think the piece is quite good. I think the problem is it's about 20 minutes, so orchestras aren't going to put a 20-minute piece on their Halloween program because that's kind of where that piece would go. I've done a band version since also. But I was sitting in the trumpet section playing my own piece and able to say to myself, hey, this kind of sounds okay,
Yeah.
And so that's not the success story that maybe you're asking about, but it was just kind of a personal realization that I was proud of something I accomplished, and if I wanted to do more of it, it would be a rewarding thing to do.
No, that's what I was asking. I think every composer has that moment. Johann de May has Lord of the Rings as his first piece.
Yeah.
And so from there, everything's set. He's just moving forward and on that. But that's not the large experience. That's not the normal experience. It's more like what you and I experience in fits and starts, small successes that become big successes. So let's talk about the recent work that won the band prize.
Oh, yeah. The symphony.
Yeah. You want to tell everybody about it?
Man, where do I start? First of all, it was a huge surprise. I don't enter competitions very often because I did a few times when I was younger. And
this is the William Revelli Band Prize,
yes,
correct?
This is the William Revelli 2017 composition competition winner with the National Band Association. And so I sent it in, mainly because I'd written a pretty significant piece of work, and so why not? And that piece was my Symphony No. 2 called Voices, which I wrote for the United States President's own Marine Band, and which was premiered at the Midwest Clinic in 2016. So there are several things that come into play, one of which is that I was very fortunate to get the opportunity to write for such a great band. The Marine Band had played a couple of my works previous to that, and so we had sort of developed a relationship, and then Colonel Fettig, Jason Fettig, had approached me basically to write whatever I wanted. He said, we'd love to have you do a large-scale work, whatever you want to do. And so it's kind of a composer's dream, write for this amazing ensemble, write whatever you want, have at it. And the reason that I'm extra excited about winning the award, or at least being recognized, because that piece was a struggle for me to write. For personal reasons, my mother had just died when I was to start writing that piece. And so I thought naively that the music would come pouring forth out of grief, and I'm going to do this for my mom and all that sort of thing. And it didn't. I really struggled. There was a month or two there where I just couldn't get anything on the page. And I think for obvious reasons, I was going down, hanging out with my dad and family, and there just wasn't time, and I just wasn't in the right place. And so that symphony, we don't have time to get into it here. It's for people who want to study the score. That symphony is all about me coming to terms with my mom's passing. And I wrote an E flat at the beginning of it, and I knew that I gave a triple forte, fortissimo, whatever, how many isomos, to the bass trombone. So cliche, I know. Everybody else has only double forte. The bass trombone gets 3 Fs. And I knew I wasn't going to reach E flat again until the very end of the piece. And so the entire symphony is me figuring out how to get back to E flat. And when I finally do, it's a big moment. And it's me coming to grips with my mom dying. And so to do an entire 20-minute large-scale piece, dealing with that, and then having it performed so amazingly well, recorded beautifully, and then to receive the award was it was just all great. No complaints.
Okay, so I don't know how to follow that up, Jim. That's
it's the personal story, which I honestly wasn't sure I'd reveal, but I think all composers and artists and humans, we have to deal with things that aren't always the best of circumstances, and we have to figure out how to respond to them. And for whatever reason, the gods decided that I would be writing a major piece of work right at that time, and so had to struggle through it.
We can't ever really predict that, but all we can do is sit down at our desks and try to write every day.
Can I add an aside? By the way, I mentioned that the piece starts with an E flat and doesn't get to E flat until the very end. This is purely coincidental. E flat can also be ES or S in German, right? So SS. My mom's initials are SS, and that was totally by accident, not planned. But afterward, I said, "Whoa."
No, that's planned. Now, Jim, you can't give that away.
No, that was definitely not planned. It's amazing. So
yeah, that's a great coincidence.
Yeah.
All right, let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about work-life balance. So how do you find that?
I try to stay as disciplined as I possibly can. My routine is to start writing by 8 or 8:30 every morning because I do treat this very much as my job. And I also know that that's when I'm freshest. That's when I have the ideas most often is first thing in the morning. So usually 8 to noon is pretty solid composing with a break for lunch and then a break for coffee with my wife at 2. It's kind of a standard thing. We have coffee together every day at 2, and I look forward to that. And then probably the rest of the day is usually some sort of business-oriented work, whether it's marketing or making contacts with people or contractual things or just things that need to be tidied up. I have discovered that I can't compose very well on the road, so I try to do all my creative stuff while I'm home, saving the part making and just very blah blah stuff for while I'm sitting in a hotel room where it's easy, where I don't have to be creative.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're not comfortable in the space, sometimes it's hard to...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Plus, I don't like writing on a computer other than the one I write on all the time.
Yeah,
my laptop doesn't work nearly as well.
How do you see a full score on a tiny laptop?
Right.
So,
what's your setup look like? I mean, we're going to get a little bit nuts and bolts inside baseball.
Yeah.
But what does your studio look like for the listeners who may not know what a composer does?
It's really low tech. I'm not very fancy. I have, I bought a relatively large monitor 5 or 6 years ago. One of the bulbs is burned out in the monitor, so half my score is dark and half of it is my desk is a complete disaster. It's got notes written all little pieces of paper with ideas or people I need to get in touch with or whatever. I have a tiny keyboard and I use Finale, and I have a piano downstairs that I go get my ideas from. Other than that, once I get my ideas, I run upstairs to my office. This is key. There's a lot of light. I like light, so it's upstairs where we have a lot of windows, and I can overlook our backyard. I like big backyards, so it's all kind of designed to at least be appealing to me as a space in which I can create.
Interesting. You should do a series of social media posts like John Mackey about your space. You know how
really?
John does that?
I haven't seen him. No.
He's got pictures of his studio. Every now and then he updates.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, I like the idea of having that view. Unfortunately, I don't have that. It's one of my big regrets. But it's funny. The studio, you don't really need a lot to be a composer. You just need a good monitor and.
Yeah.
Do you use your horns much? Do you have a trumpet nearby?
Do I use my trumpets to compose? I used to. Some Facebook friends of mine, if they're listening to this, they'll know that I was trying to do an embouchure change in the last year or two, just because I wanted to get back in the game a little bit. Not because I want to be a professional trumpeter again, but because I don't want to lose touch with what it's like to play. That's crucial.
Right.
I mean, that's another subject, conducting, performing, composing. I think they're all intertwined. If you can do all three, each one will inform the other. I mean, I think Johan talked about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, if you want to talk about that, I didn't play for a long time. I'm just now getting back into it myself. Yeah. It's making a difference too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the short story is my embouchure change didn't work, so I'm not, frankly, I don't have time.
Yeah.
So I'm not playing because I don't have time, which I guess is a good thing. But as much as I could, I would play to just sort of inform my composing. But yeah, I've been conducting a lot more lately, and that completely informs everything I do as a composer. My composing and the way I create scores now that I'm conducting, they're all. I'm motioning with my hands, like your listeners can see what I'm doing. But everything affects the other, and I think it's crucial. Now that I have to look at scores, I compose. If I'm on the podium, I need those scores to look good. If I'm conducting.
Absolutely. So how much conducting experience did you have?
Like my composing, everything I do is kind of self-taught. So I sat in an orchestra since the age of 10, looking at conductors. So I know it's important to me as a player to see from a conductor. I haven't had the official left-hand training and all that sort of thing, which I think is great. But I think I can handle myself well enough to get the job done. But the key is that I'm always learning. So every time I stand on the podium, it's an educational experience about what I can take from that to the next one. And I've conducted lots of bands and lots of orchestras, and I love doing it. So all of this is because I love doing it. I wouldn't do it if I didn't get joy out of it.
Sure, yeah. So I have a couple questions here that are sort of big questions that I ask all of my guests.
Okay.
And the biggest one is, what are the challenges that you think are facing music and music education in the 21st century? And how do we best meet those? Challenging facing music education is going to be tough for me to answer because I'm not really in that. How about music?
Arena.
What we do as quote unquote classical musicians.
All I can do is tell you my own personal challenges I deal with almost on a daily basis. And that is to not be swayed by the instant. I don't want to try to become a pop composer. I think the pop world is hugely successful, and it's really easy to try to be drawn into creating music that fits that 3 or 4 minute genre that is created just for that reason. They decided at some point, whether it was because of records, that's all they could fit on one side of a 45 record or whatever. A pop tune had to be 3 or 4 minutes and then now that seems to be what kids expect. And I don't want to write music to that. Yes, I have to write 3 or 4 minute pieces sometimes, but I'm not going to try to write. I think you know what I'm saying. I'm very dedicated to writing music with quote unquote depth. That if somebody decides to dig into my scores, they're going to find more meaning there. I mean, if somebody were to want to dig into my symphony score, they're going to find a lot there that I put very much on purpose so that people might have an aha moment if they want to look for it. And that's what I think. I think that's our responsibility. I might be sounding like an old fuddy-duddy, but I think it's our responsibility as creative artists to make sure that there's this level of intellectual depth. I'll use that word again.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfectly fair. We need to have classical music. Concert music has a place in our society.
Yes, exactly. There's reasons for both.
Just like pop music has a place. All right, that's a good answer, actually. So we're, as we mentioned, and everyone can hear in the noisy background, we're here at FMEA. Mm-hmm. So what's coming up today that you want to tell everyone about? Why are we sitting here?
Why are we sitting here? I'm a guest of the University of Florida. They had me down because Rex Richardson, who you mentioned, is playing my second trumpet concerto called Rex Stream. A very crazy trumpet concerto that he premiered in 2010 and is now played on 5 continents in like 40 different performance venues for band, brass band, orchestra, piano reduction, the whole bit. So he's playing that this afternoon at 4 o'clock, and I was down to do a brief residency yesterday at the University of Florida, talk with their conductors, their band, their trumpet players to share my experiences, and so that's why I'm here. Always good to come to Florida in January, so
can't beat,
no argument.
Really can't beat this. We probably need to get a picture for the podcast of like what we can see.
Absolutely.
All right, so I want to ask you. I usually ask what would be the last piece of music you'd want to engage with. Say that again. Instead of your favorite piece, what's the last piece of music you'd want to engage with? So, because I usually ask people their favorite piece.
Of my own or somebody else's?
Of someone else's.
Oh.
Like if you had one last piece to play or conduct or even to put on the radio.
Man, see, the problem is I just listened to Johann's, and I sent him an email right after you and I talked because his answers were almost literally the same as mine.
He said the Rite of Spring?
I probably wouldn't have said that one right off the bat. Mm-hmm. I would have said that one just because we all know how amazing that piece is.
Yeah, sure.
But he said West Side Story and he said Romeo and Juliet.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And those are just killer pieces.
Yeah.
And, because they incorporate things which I think are so important to every piece of music. Melody. I'm going to say that first. I think melody is hugely important. The colors they get out of the ensembles they're working with, Bernstein and Prokofiev is what I'm talking about. The colors they get, the freshness they get, the rhythms they get, the orchestration. I mean, these are just pieces you could sit with forever and just say, wow.
Yeah.
If you can sit with a piece on the 25th time and still say, wow, I mean, that's hard to beat. So I hate to say the same pieces that he did. Darn it, I'm not original. Darn you, Johann. Can we put mine in front of his in order on your podcast?
No, too late now.
No, but those are great pieces. I can't argue with those.
How about one of yours? If you wanted to point the listeners to one piece by Jim Stephenson, what would you want them to hear first?
At this point, wow, that's tough. It's the one I'm about to write.
Yep.
No, it's. I'm really proud of the symphony I just wrote. Mm-hmm. We've already discussed it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad other people recognized it, but my second symphony called Voices, I'm proud of the reasons I had for composing it, and I'm proud of not always aiming high with the piece, never putting in anything cliche in there or just saying, this will work. Every measure was like, how do I make this measure the best it can be? And that's for, over a 20-minute piece. That's, kind composers have done it over an entire opera, which is obviously a goal of mine. Not obviously, that is a goal of mine as well. I really want to write opera because I love telling stories.
Do you have a libretto in mind?
Not yet. I wonder whether I should write it myself or read up and come up with something. But that's definitely a bucket list is an opera.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens.
I don't know a composer who doesn't have writing an opera as a bucket list item.
I'm just never original, but it's just, any chance we get to tell a story.
Yeah, no.
Especially over a long period of time.
It feels like writing an opera is just one of those boxes to check as a composer because it's such an important art form.
And you get to do so many different things. You can go chamber music for a while if you want. Obviously, there's the voice aspect, there's the language. There's telling a story. There's going huge for the climactic moments if you want, or tricking the audience and not going huge. You have so much time to just dive in and do what you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what advice would you give to your 20-year-old self?
Be patient. Keep inventing. Work hard. Try to be a nice person every single day because we talked about those interrelationships are so important. To never give up. To always say. See, here's the thing. I always say yes to everything. And people say, really? Sometimes you got to say no, right? The point is, I said no to trumpet playing. So I'm saying yes to all these other things because they're all a part of now being a composer / conductor or whatever.
Yeah.
So I already said the big no to trumpet playing. Now I'm saying yes to anything that has to do with creating new music because I just love every aspect of it, including arranging still. I still do that. So.
Yeah. Well, that's a tough balance. I mean, when you say no, when you say yes, but I got good advice a long time ago, which is to say yes to as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, within reason. I mean, you can't write 50 pieces in a year, so you're going to have to say no to some things, but it's...
right.
But yeah, we all figure it out. We figure it out.
Yeah, sure. All right, Jim, so what do you have coming up that you want to share with the listener?
Well, I think by the time when you'll be publishing this,
sometime in the early part of February.
Okay, good. So I can officially say the big news because I've had to hold on to it for almost a year and a half. The exact details. It's exciting for me because it's my hometown orchestra. I'm writing a concerto for Charlie Vernon to play with Chicago Symphony. And it's with Riccardo Muti conducting. So it's again going back to my mom. Since I've known for a year and a half, I was able to tell her before she died. So that was really cool. So I think by the end of January, the CSO will officially announce it. So I think we're safe to say. And then I'm having a Minnesota Orchestra premiere this June, and I think it's not official yet, so I can't mention any names. But I think I'll be writing my third symphony, which will be for orchestra. So as we talked about recently, I'm juggling both band and orchestra world.
Sure.
But, so I'm excited about those things and several others that I apologize to those who I'm not mentioning, but
well, as I said, I'll link all of this into the show notes so the listeners should be able to find this. Jim, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Let's take a picture. It's beautiful here.
Yeah, let's do it. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Mark.